Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 build guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering my pick for the best Druid build in Baldur's Gate 3. This is an exciting one because patch 5 just came out, and so we will be making this build for Honor mode, although of course it will still work for Tactician or lower difficulties. And this will be a part of my basic builds series, so this is intended to showcase and maximize the strength of Druid as a class. A rule for these builds is we have to take the majority of our levels in Druid, although in this case you're highly incentivized to stay in Druid for all 12 levels, and so we will be doing that. There's a couple things that are really exciting about building for Honor mode, and a couple changes that are specific to Honor mode that I will mention. The biggest change that we have to take into account when making these builds is that we can no longer reliably acquire Ethel's hair. If you don't know what that means, it's a spoiler, so don't worry about it. And so any builds that are based on that are no longer 100% reliable to achieve because it's an Iron Man mode and you might not get it. So for that reason, I already tried to avoid using it, but for these builds going forwards, I will always be avoiding using it in my build guides, except in very specific cases. Alright, so before we begin, I'd also like to quickly thank Jonalov Holt again for the 59 kroner donation. Thank you so much, my friend. I really appreciate it. So let's dive right in and make an Honor mode character. We are, of course, using Jaheira as the example character, but Druids are, I think, maybe the best main character, because they can fit into, if you don't care about dialogue skills, because they can fit into any party and fill basically every role in the game. Druids are, thanks to a buff in patch 5, one of the best damage-dealing melee characters in the game. They're a full spellcaster with access to excellent utility spells as well as great control and damage. They have summons, and they also tank better than any other character in the game because they effectively have 3 health bars every short rest. The reason for this is that when you wild shape into a wild shape form, you have the full hit points of the wild shape form, and enemies have to reduce you to 0 hit points in that form before they can start damaging your actual character's hit points at all, which means that you basically have 3 full health bars they have to get through, and can end up with pretty solid defenses as you go regardless, meaning that you have great sustainability, great damage, tons of utility as a character, fits extremely well into any party. This, I think, is one of the top tier builds now for Honor mode, as well as for any Tactician playthrough. It's a great build for Jaheira or Halsin, as well as for a main character. Alright, let's get into building. So the first thing that we have to do, of course, is fix these stats, because the starting stats for Druid are pretty bad, and we're actually going to take a fairly specific stat spread because of a choice that we're going to make later on, which I'll talk about when we get there. We need to start with 16 Wisdom, and unlike almost every other build that I make, we're going to start with 15 Constitution, and then 16 Dexterity. With our remaining 2 points, you probably want to place these into Intelligence, because there's a couple enemies in the game that have Intelligence targeting saving throw effects, but if you're a main character, maybe you want them in Charisma just to give you slightly better dialogue skills, or you could put them in Strength to give you better jumping and carry weight. The last 2 points aren't incredibly important, but Intelligence is probably the most optimal pick. If you are confident that you can get Ethel's hair, you could do 17 Wisdom, and that's also a great split as well. But for Honor mode, I don't think you can reliably ensure that you'll get that, because you might fail the dialogue check or accidentally kill her. For our skill selection, there's nothing that we particularly need here except for Perception. As a high Wisdom character, Perception is, you're going to be the best character in the game to do perception checks, and so it's very good to have access to that. If you're a main character, of course, you might want to take a background that gives you a dialogue skill of some kind, just so you have some access to that. Though Druids are not going to win any prizes for Charisma regardless, so I wouldn't worry too much about passing your dialogue checks. For your second skill, it really just doesn't matter at this point, so kind of take whatever. I think the one that comes up most often is Insight, but Medicine also occasionally comes up. Animal Handling, you can solve every check in the game that uses Animal Handling with the Speak with Animals spell, as far as I'm aware. Maybe there's 1 or 2 that you can't. And Survival is only used to dig up chests, which you can do just by digging in the area that they're in, even if you don't pass the Survival check. So that is all totally irrelevant. Those skills are just almost never worth taking. For our cantrip selection, you are definitely going to want guidance, especially on honor mode where you cannot save scum skill checks. The ability to add a d4 to every ability check that you make is incredibly powerful, super strong ability, maybe the best spell in the game secretly. Every party should have access to guidance, and you often want multiple instances of guidance so that you can add multiple different stacking things to a character. For example, if you have enhanceability on a character, then you want to have guidance on a different character so that you can use both at once. You don't just want to stack all of your skill buffs onto one character. For our second skill, you definitely want a combat-oriented cantrip. For our second cantrip, there are really two choices here. Those are Thorn Whip or Produce Flame. Produce Flame does slightly more damage and has some utility in that it creates light, and Thorn Whip can be used to reposition enemies. I slightly prefer Thorn Whip because repositioning enemies is quite powerful, but choosing between these two, it's really more a matter of taste. Alright, that is our level 1 build. Let's jump to level 2. Notice the giant cow in the background. That's actually because if you are a main character, I believe the optimal race to pick for this build is Dwergar, because you can use the Dwergars in large and then wild shape to be a really, really big bear if you want to. And that is pretty useful. And of course, starting every combat invisible is really powerful for druids because you want to start every combat with a concentration spell and then turn into a wild shape form. I'll talk a little bit about how druids will typically fight later on in the video as well. Alright, at level 2, we have to make the single most important selection that we're going to make during this build, and that is what subclass are we going to go. Druids are very interesting for subclasses because all three are really good. Most characters, most classes in the game have at least one that's significantly weaker than the other two, and many have one subclass that's way out ahead of the other two, but all three druid subclasses are really strong for various reasons. For an optimized character on heroic mode specifically, I think you are going to be best off with Circle of the Moon. But if you're playing on Tactician or lower, I actually recommend Circle of the Land. The reason for this is that on honor mode, excuse me, I keep saying heroic. On honor mode, haste works differently than it does on lower difficulty settings, and one of the best things that Circle of the Land gets is access to haste. I'll do a full Circle of the Land druid guide later on, but for this build, we're going to focus on Circle of the Moon. Circle of the Moon gets you two really important things. One, it gets you new wild shape forms, and the bear form is at this level better than the other forms you have access to. It's going to be your best combat form, so you'll usually want to turn into a bear, and it gets you bonus action wild shaping. This is really powerful because when you are in wild shape, you can continue to concentrate on a spell. What this means is that druids will typically want to start their fights by casting a high-level concentration spell and then wild shaping in the same turn. If you were a land druid, then typically you'd want to cast haste on yourself and then wild shape because it requires an action. But as a moon druid, you can cast any concentration spell and then wild shape in the same turn. You won't do anything else in your first round of combat because you won't be able to use like the bonus action attacks of some wild shape forms, but you get to get a head start on being in wild shape while also having your concentration spells up, which is very powerful. For that reason, also, I should also mention what our prepared spells are at this level. We are going to focus on having good concentration spells available at least one of each level to make sure that we can always spend our resources optimally at the beginning of fights. So what we're going to take here for level 1 is you will always want access to Healing Word on every character that can get it. Longstrider is very important. It's not included in the tooltip for reasons I don't understand, but Longstrider is a ritual spell, meaning it does not require a spell slot to cast, so you can cast this on your whole party. Basically, having access to this on any character in your party means that your whole party moves 10 feet faster for the entire day. That's an incredible buff and extremely useful, especially on difficult modes where you might need to quickly get out of a combat if it's starting to go south to prevent you from dying. You will also very likely want Ice Knife. This is both a good combat option and has a bunch of utility because it leaves a field of ice on the ground. if you cast this under an enemy and then they try to walk on it, they may trip and fall prone. And if an enemy falls prone on their turn, as opposed to you knocking them prone on your turn, they lose the rest of their turn. It costs them their entire turn if they trip and fall. So Ice Knife is secretly an incredibly strong crowd control spell that can really take enemies out. You will also very likely want access to Fog Cloud. Fog Cloud is really good if you have other ranged characters, and also good for any fights where you are trying to stay in Druid form rather than in Wild Shape form, because you can stand your party inside of it. Enemies cannot shoot you because you are heavily obscured, and any enemies that come in after you will be blinded and have disadvantage on their attack rolls. And then if you have a ranged character, you can step out of it, make an attack, and then step back into it on your turn. Fog Cloud is some of the best damage prevention in the game as a result. It's very similar to Darkness, which is also one of the most abusive spells in the game for the same reason. For our last spell, there's a couple utility options that are worth considering here. Entangle is very good. It's a concentration spell that inflicts a very powerful debuff. Fairy Fire can give you advantage on attack rolls and also against invisible enemies. It's mandatory to have this, so if you know you're going up against enemies that have invisibility, Fairy Fire is the best way to counteract that. And Create or Destroy Water has a lot of utility throughout the game. It's often worth just having access to this because there's a bunch of other things we can do. For a default, I think you're going to want Entangle. Druid level 3, we get access to our level 2 spells, and so there's a couple here that I think are really worth mentioning. One just got buffed, and we're actually going to change our spells fairly significantly here. One just got buffed, and that is Heat Metal, which no longer randomly expires. Heat Metal is very good against any character you can use it on, although it is worse for druids, so we won't be taking it, but I just wanted to mention that it was recently buffed. The reason it's worse is that spells like Heat Metal and Moonbeam you can still concentrate on, but in Baldur's Gate 3, while you're wild shaped, you cannot reactivate these spells. So if you have Moonbeam concentrated, you can't move it, even though you should be able to. In tabletop D&D, you can move your Moonbeam, fire your Call Lightning, reactivate Heat Metal, that kind of thing. But in Baldur's Gate 3, it's not possible in wild shape form. So you want to avoid concentration spells that require you to continue to activate them turn after turn, in favor of concentration spells that are powerful regardless. The best of these is Flaming Sphere. Enemies will focus this. It makes the attacks, not you, so you don't have to have it do stuff. You don't have to reactivate it, so you can use it in wild shape form. The Spike Growth is very good as well. This is a very powerful field effect that can be used against enemies that can't jump or enemies that you have trapped in a corridor. It's a huge AoE and is extremely strong as well. And Hold Person, while I'm not as big a fan of Hold Person in Baldur's Gate as I am in Tabletop, because enemies get to save when you cast it and then again at the beginning of their turn before they actually skip a turn, Hold Person is still an extremely powerful effect, and also you benefit very strongly from it because you are going to be making melee attacks as a Moon Druid character, so those will be critical hits. So I would likely take these two. There's a couple other options that you can use for your default setup, but I think these are going to serve you best overall. At Druid level 4, we get to see two things. One, we get new wild shape forms, and I think the bear is usually still better than the Deep Rothe, although the Dire Raven's ability to blind is actually pretty interesting in some fights. It's got very low health, but can be useful. The Deep Rothe's charge lets you do some additional damage, but generally I think you're going to prefer the bear form for most combats. We do, however, get a feat, and there's a specific feat that interacts extremely powerfully with Druid as of patch 5, and that is Tavern Brawler. When you make an unarmed attack, you add your strength modifier twice, both to hit and damage. This is extraordinarily powerful for wild shapes, of course, because all of the wild shapes, except for our Myrmidon forms at level 10, have are unarmed attacks, meaning that they benefit from the Tavern Brawler damage. In Dungeons & Dragons and in Baldur's Gate, there's a concept called bounded accuracy, which basically means that your chance to hit should never be too high or too low. This breaks that rule, allowing you to get close to 100% hit chance because you are doubling your chance to hit, or you're doubling your strength modifier's effect on your chance to hit, as well as its chance on damage. So you get to break that rule, and also we get to increase our strength or constitution, letting us get up to 16 constitution. That's great because it gives us more hit points and the ability to concentrate on stuff while we're not in wild shape form and so on, but most importantly, this is going to double our strength modifier for attacks and damage. It does mean that our wisdom is a little lower than it would be for another caster class at this level, but it's definitely worth the lower save DCs in my opinion, especially because so many of your solid concentration spells, things like Flaming Sphere or Spike Growth, do not have any saves associated with them, so you don't need to have high wisdom for those. For our second cantrip, here I think there's a couple options. You can certainly take Produce Flame for the utility, but you already have a damage option. So I would take Resistance. This will come up occasionally, and especially on Heroic mode, if you know you're going to... I keep doing that. Honor mode, if you know you're going to need to make a save in advance, you should take Resistance, because then you can precast it, have a bonus to that save. And that's very important, given that you can't reload, so there are some saves in the game you really don't want to fail. Druid level 5 gets us access to 3rd level spells as well as Wild Strike, meaning that all of our wild shape forms can attack twice now. This is super powerful, it's the same as extra attack, but remember that we are getting double damage from Tavern Brawler, so these double attacks are applying the bonus damage even more often, or even more bonus damage compared to other characters that get extra attack. Something like a fighter will only be applying their strength bonus once, we're applying it twice. For our level 3 spells, there's actually not a lot that you really benefit from at level 3 because the best of these concentration effects at level 3 is Call Lightning, which you can't really use as a druid because you can't reactivate it, so you can't subsequently cast the later casts of Call Lightning. Normally this gives you 10 turns of uses of Call Lightning, but for a druid it doesn't, so it's significantly worse than it would be for other characters. So at this point I think you want Plant Growth. It's a non-concentration spell that's very similar to Spike Growth, in that it creates a field effect, but this one quarters enemy movement speed, which is very powerful, especially if you have them locked in a field. It's also a good way to create a gigantic fire surface if that's something that you do want to do, although for a level 3 spell, I think that's usually a pretty weak use of an action, as well as a resource. And then a couple other things. If you have an ally that wants Barkskin, you can have Barkskin. That is a concentration spell that you can be concentrating on. It's not good to cast this on yourself for your wild shape forms. Typically this won't be very useful because many wild shape forms already have high base AC, and this will just overwrite that. So you'll only gain like 1 or 2 points of AC maximum from casting Barkskin on yourself. I think it's best on bear form, which has low AC. The Barkskin on bear form is pretty useful. But then of course if you lose concentration on it, then you'll lose the AC. That being said, there's not a lot else at this level that you might want, so you might want to take Barkskin if you need something to concentrate on throughout the day. Typically in combat, though, you are going to want to cast a concentration spell and then Wild Shape, so you're not going to want to have a day-long concentration spell, and you're better off with something like Spike Growth. Again, remember that you can always change your spells outside of combat at any time, meaning that this prepared spell list is just guidelines. This is not set in stone at all. In fact, you can and should be changing your prepared spells very frequently throughout the day because the game lets you do that. At this level, you get access to Panther and Owlbear. Owlbear is slightly worse for Moon Druids than for other Druids because one of the big advantages of Owlbear is that you have a bonus action damaging leap, which lets you make an attack as a bonus action in the same turn that you spend an action to Wild Shape into it. Moon Druids don't benefit from that, but it's still the best combat form that you'll have access to at this level. It's just a really solid form, and it's the only, I believe, 20 strength Wild Shape form, and it can go up to 22 strength with the Rage, meaning that it can benefit +6 from Tavern Brawler. Obviously, that's ridiculously strong. +6 to both attack and damage from Tavern Brawler in Owlbear form is great, and it means that you're going to want to stay in Owlbear form for most of the game. This is going to be your default form for every combat. You also get Primal Strike, which gives you magical attacks. This is unique to Moon Druids, and one of the major reasons to become a Moon Druid is actually this feature. There are a lot of enemies who are resistant to non-magical damage, and this lets you overcome that, which is great. Druid level 7, we get access to level 4 spells, and this is where things get really exciting for Druids. Most characters get their power spike at level 3 spells. Druids actually get their major power spike at level 4 spells, which is interestingly different from where other characters end up. So there's a lot of really strong spells that we're going to want to potentially concentrate on at this level or just have access to. The first of these is Conjure Woodland Being. This is a day-long summon that also has another summon and can itself cast Entangle, which means that you are basically doubling your concentration spells per fight if you have Conjure Woodland Being out. Super powerful, great to be able to just have summons running around all the time. Extremely important spell for Druids, and I highly recommend taking it. Wall of Fire single-handedly solves several encounters, and is also one of the best spells to concentrate on before you turn into Wild Shape. You can trap enemies in it by getting in melee with them in your Wild Shape forms, and at the very least, trap enemies in it insofar as you'll get an attack of opportunity against them if they try to leave the Wall of Fire. Many Wild Shape forms have ways to knock enemies prone, and if you trap them in the Wall of Fire, that's also very good. A couple other really solid control spells. Polymorph is good. It's a save or just be out of the combat for 5 turns, which is pretty nice. You have to be careful not to damage it, but it's very good. But in general, I would go with Confusion. This hits a group of enemies for 3 full turns of disable. It's not 100%, and I have had some inconsistencies with Confusion actually working. Sometimes enemies will just act normally, but they did say they bug fixed a lot of stuff like this, so I'm trusting Larian to have fixed it. Any bugs that were still outstanding with Confusion, and when it's working, it's one of the best spells in the game in terms of CCing enemies, crowd controlling enemies. Another one that's really worth preparing in a lot of fights is Freedom of Movement, because knocking an ally out of stun is actually often worth an action, and of course you can have this running all day. It doesn't take concentration, so this is also just a valuable day-long buff, though it's competing with Conjure Woodland Being for your 4th level spell slots for day-long buffs. And Ice Storm is also very good, mostly not for the damage, but because it creates a gigantic ice field. For the same reason Ice Knife is good, enemies slipping and falling on the Ice Storm field are going to lose their turns as well. My default setup is going to be something like this, because I actually do value having access to Freedom of Movement, but again, you're going to want to change your spells prepared based on what you think you're going to encounter that day. Here you get Sabertooth Tiger, which is pretty nice. I think this one is unique, and this gives you Shred Armor and Regeneration, which is pretty solid, as well as an additional feat. So here, of course, we're just going to boost our Wisdom. At this point, our save DCs are starting to become more important because we have access to things like Confusion and so on. Wall of Fire even, although Wall of Fire works even if they fail the save, or even if they succeed the save, but increasing our save DCs is really important at this point, and we already are doing massive melee damage because of Tavern Brawler. At Druid level 9, we get access to 5th level spells. There's not a whole lot here that is a major shift in what we're going to be doing. A couple that are worth mentioning are Wall of Stone. It's a concentration spell that this one, similar to Wall of Fire, there are some encounters this just solves by trapping 2 groups of enemies on either side of it and letting you attack them, half at a time, or you can use it to lock a powerful enemy in a corner. For example, if you have another character cast Wall of Fire while an enemy is standing in a corner, you can then use Wall of Stone along the corner to trap them in it, especially if you're inside a room that doesn't let them jump over the Wall of Stone, that can be a very powerful effect that just traps them in a box of fire, causing them to just slowly tick out. You do have to have a pretty specific circumstance for that to work, but there are some encounters that this will just solve by itself. Conjure Elemental, you can definitely use this. I typically think you're just going to want Conjure Woodland Being, but Elementals are also good. And Insect Plague does have some uses, so this is what I would probably consider. This is typically worse than Wall of Fire in terms of damage output, but is going to also create difficult terrain, which is good against some characters, and the disadvantage on perception checks doesn't matter, but this is an okay damage field. I think most of the time you're going to be better off with Wall of Fire, so you may want to go back for one of the spells that we didn't take at earlier levels. Another one that's worth mentioning also, especially on Honor Mode, is Protection from Energy. There are some fights that this will help a lot with, because you know you're going to be facing certain elemental type enemies. Druid level 10, this is what we're really here for, because at 10th level Druid, you get Improved Wild Strike, allowing you to attack twice with every action. Now, the reason that this is less powerful, the Land Druids also get this, but the reason that Land Druids suffer on Honor Mode now is that Haste can no longer benefit from these extra attack features. So in your hasted action, you'll only be able to make one attack. So you only go from 3 to 4 attacks rather than on Tactician mode or lower, where you go from 3 to 6 attacks by having access to haste. That's why I think on Tactician or lower, you're going to be better off with a Land Druid, and on Honor mode, you're going to be better off with a Moon Druid. Because making 3 attacks for every action, of course, is extremely strong. You also get access to Dilophosaurus, which is actually a pretty nice wild shape form. It gives you a ranged attack, which is kind of useful, as well as the Myrmidon forms that are unique to Moon Druid. Now, the Myrmidon forms are less good for you because Tavern Brawler is so powerful, though they do still have some pretty cool stuff, and it's worth mentioning that the Earth Myrmidon does not have a weapon, unlike the other 3, and does still benefit from Tavern Brawler. It only has 18 strength, though, so it's not going to be quite as powerful as the Owlbear in terms of using Tavern Brawler, but it's still just a very good character. It's got a lot of hit points and has a bunch of extra abilities. Burrow is a nice bonus action damage, and it gets to attack 3 times, dealing plus 8 damage on every attack, so that's always very nice anyways. Plus 8 damage from 2 uses of your 18 strength on this character, whereas Owlbear is doing plus 6 damage, or plus 12 damage on every attack, so it's getting a little more damage from Tavern Brawler, but a little less from its native abilities. There are also some cool uses just for all of the abilities of these Myrmidon forms that can be used for utility rather than pure damage. If you are a Dwergar, you won't need the invisibility from the Air Myrmidon, but the fact that it exists is kind of nice. Raging Vortex silencing is quite useful for certain characters, and also notice that this is not a concentration effect, so you can just have a 10-turn long field effect with no concentration. That's pretty cool if you can keep enemies trapped in it. Muck to Metal is okay. You get increased armor class, but that's not particularly valuable. The main advantage here is that you get healing vapors from Water Myrmidon, which also you can use as a poison effect if you use it on enemies, but healing nearby allies with the healing vapors can be very useful, because this won't take turns in subsequent turns of combat. You only have to spend the action on it once. And Explosive Icicle also creates an ice surface at 60-foot range, which again, we've talked about how good the ice surfaces are, so very much worth having access to this. In general, though, you're still going to want to be an Owlbear in most of your combats, and in some you'll want to be an Earth Myrmidon if you need slightly less damage, but the addition of some extra utility. For our cantrip selection, it really doesn't matter what we take at this point. I guess take Produce Flame, because you can use it to produce light, but none of those will have any utility starting at level 10. At this point, there is actually an interesting split. Because we've gotten the best thing that we can get from Druid, if you don't want to increase your Wisdom to 20, you could actually leave Druid and take 2 levels in another class. There are some that are really powerful for this. The best option is probably Fighter for Action Surge and a defensive fighting style. Both of those things will work in Wild Shape form, so it's very powerful to have access to those. I recommend just sticking with Druid, getting your Wisdom to 20, and getting access to 6th level spells. In particular, Wall of Thorns, which is great damage, quarters enemy movement speed, so it's a combined plant growth and Wall of Fire. Extremely powerful spell. It by itself helps to keep enemies trapped in it, and it also does tons of damage when they are trapped in it. So this is a great spell and a great start to every combat. Also, having Hero's Feast on some characters in your party, you want access to this somewhere, whether from a druid or a cleric, because there are a couple encounters that it will be critically important to have access to this spell for in Act 3, especially again on Honor Mode, where if you get stun locked by enemy fear effects, you will just lose. So it's going to be really, really important to have access to Hero's Feast on somewhere in your party, and this is a very good candidate because you want to get to level 20, or level 20. If only we could get to level 20. You want to get to level 12 for 20 Wisdom anyways. You won't prepare Hero's Feast every day or cast it every day, but there are some boss fights in particular that it's critically important for, and that you will want to have access to it for. And of course, at level 12, we just max out our Wisdom, maxing out our save DCs and everything else. We get to then prepare some extra spells, and of course the really important one is Wall of Thorns. I actually like to have Sunbeam prepared as well, because you are starting to run out of prepared spells that really matter to have access to at this point. Enhanced Leap is also very good. You may want to go back for that, so stuff like that. But Sunbeam is very good if you are in a fight where you aren't using a Wild Shape form and can just keep activating Sunbeam. And there's a couple encounters that this is just extremely good against because of it being radiant damage. And there are some enemies that are just naturally vulnerable to radiant damage, so you may want to bring Sunbeam for those fights as well. Just something to keep in mind as well. Alright, my friends, this has been the guide to the Druid. A typical combat turn for you is going to look like casting whatever your... Oh, we don't need that one. I was just testing with a Dwergar whether Enlarge worked on your... Enlarge worked on your wild shape forms, and the answer is it does, which is really fun. You can become a gigantic bear if you're a Dwergar by casting Enlarge before you cast wild shape. Dwergar Enlarge is also not concentration, so you get to do that and a concentration spell. Your typical combat turn on a druid is going to look like casting a very powerful concentration spell. I think often that's going to be Wall of Fire, and then using your bonus action in order to turn into a wild shape form, usually an Owlbear. Once you're in your Owlbear form, you are going to be able to do 3 attacks every round with Tavern Brawler, plus your bonus action attack, and all of those will apply that, dealing massive amounts of damage every turn. So we both break bounded accuracy and do additional damage every turn. So notice that we're going to do... the animation on Owlbear is very slow. So that was 27 damage from our first attack, and from our second attack, the wardrobe has slashing, has slashing resistance, so it's getting halved. 27 damage again, and from our third attack, only 20 damage because we rolled pretty badly, and then we also get a bonus action attack, which we can use to make the Crushing Flight here. Which is going to deal an additional Tavern Brawler application for some significant additional damage plus 20. So you're going to be doing somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 damage a round on a typical round of combat, and that's without any buffs or additional effects going on. Plus, the full effect of your concentration spell is continuing to tick down, at least until you take enough damage to lose concentration on it. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the Druid. The Druid is also extremely item agnostic, so we don't actually need any specific gear. You're going to want a shield and good medium armor. I guess I should just quickly say that before people get confused. But you really don't need any specific gear except stuff that works in wild shape, and it will say on it, this works in wild shape. Also, stuff that increases your spell DC is very good. Alright, I've tried to do this outro a couple times, but thank you for watching, my friends. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. I'm really excited to bring you honor mode videos going forwards. I'm really glad that they did that, and as always, if you have enjoyed the video, do please feel free to take a moment to leave a comment or like the video. I appreciate you taking the time to do that. It really helps out with the algorithm. I hate having to harass everyone to do that every time, but it really does make a difference in terms of view count. So if you want other people to benefit from these guides, then please take the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game content. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.